morning, students, and welcome to our History 3090, which is, as you can see, women's history in the 1950s to the 2000s. Now, I'm going to pass you guys out a syllabus, not that you don't already have one, but just keep in mind it is January 31st today. You should have already completed the reading for January 31st. Matt?
Sorry, Professor. Okay.
Dr. Kim? And I think I gave you two. Here's some lecture notes. There you are. Okay. You guys can look that over if you would like. But like I said, it is January 31st. The topic of today's lecture will be racism and feminism. Everyone sounds good? All right, just before we begin, we have midterms that will be back next week. You guys took them last week. Give myself about 2 weeks to grade the midterms. So far, I've loved the answers. The comprehensive essay, you guys have done a great job of reflecting and synthesizing your themes for the first part of the course. Coming up, I just want to call your attention to the sources we've been reading. You probably recognize this boy, Women's America, Refocusing the Past, some documents out of there, as well as Betty Friedan, who will talk a little bit more today on the feminine mystique. You guys have read a couple chapters in there. But coming up, I want to draw your attention to two sources you'll be reading in the last 3 weeks of this course, which is We Should All Be Feminist and A Room of One's Own. You'll be reading those simultaneously and writing a deep, reflective paper on themes of these courses and how they compare and contrast. Sounds good? So everyone just remember these two books are coming up. Today, if you guys have brought your books, awesome, thank you. We'll be reading out of Ain't I a Woman, Bell Hooks, about Black women and feminism, as well as the American Women's Movement 1945 to 2000, which has been our main textbook in this course, our main primary source. Capiche? Capache. Okay, thank you. All right, let us begin. Any questions? Any at all? Okay, awesome. All right, so like I said, racism and feminism, quite the topic we have today. So if you guys have any questions, please raise your hand throughout the lecture, as well as taking notes, synthesizing themes, thinking about questions you might have at the end of the lecture is always good. And yeah, let's begin. Here we have 1950s classical feminist images. This is how women were portrayed in the 1950s primarily. Before I begin this lecture, I do want to say that I will be speaking in generalization tones, which is generalization, again, which can be oftentimes a little bit strenuous for professors, because overgeneralizing could get me in some tight spots. So I just want to warn you, there's overgeneralization. Obviously, not all 1950s women were looking like this or doing this. Feminism and racism are two ideologies that are multifaceted. They are layered. They are complex. I'm speaking about it today from one angle only. So follow me here, challenge me here, think with me here, gain a different perspective here. Capiche? Okay. All right, thank you. That was my little intro to this before we dive on in. Like I said, 1950s women. What do we think of white women during 1950s? Housework, all right? So you can see these ads were even showing, oh, darling, you didn't burn the beer. Or, oh, it's a man's world. This is kind of what we were working with in this worldview in the 1950s. Let's step into the 1960s. Let's step into the 1970s. Let's step into the 1980s and 1990s. What changes? Fashion trends. Fashion trends do change. And these are the women that we are seeing today, we'll be analyzing today in our feminist and racism lecture. So I just want to get your head set on what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about feminism today. And then we're going to go to a broader picture about what the ideology of feminism has to do with racism. What's our relationship? How are they correlating? How are they stronger together or apart? How is feminism actually hurting racism? How are white women feminists actually hurting their black women feminists? All right? So, like I said, feminism, racism, big ideologies in our culture. A big ism. Dr. Kennedy doesn't like the isms. We are in the 20th century today. We are talking about the isms. We are speaking on ideologies that make up a lot of our world, speaking on ideologies that are complicated and challenging, and today we're going to dive right in. And you can't ignore feminism. 49.5% of the population are women. 49.58% of the population are women. We cannot run from this topic, no matter how many buzzwords we hear about it. All right, to begin, one more time, second wave feminism. You guys have heard the wave, second wave, 1950s to about 1980s, dealing with a lot of sexuality, household, family dynamics, dealing with the patriarchy. Step into the 80s with me, step into 2010, we are entering into third wave feminism. We are entering into media, we are entering into internet, we are entering into inclusivity, all right? Dealing with the first wave or second wave, 1950s, 1980s, dealing with the third wave, 1980s, 2010-ish, okay? That's kind of the range that we're working with. Those are the documents that you also read today. Definitions. Anyone would like to read this out loud? Hayden, you can take a stab at it with feminism.
Feminism, the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. You want to keep going?
Matt, racism.
Racism, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized.
Awesome. And our big question we are talking about today, how do these two relate? What is the relationship? What are the structures of feminism and racism? How did they coincide? How did they really contrast? How did they rub off on each other, as we like to say? All right, before we begin, you guys have read a lot. Not before we began, we've already begun, sorry. In our lecture, you guys have read a lot of Betty Friedan. Just want to mention her really quick. She's an icon of the 1950s. She wrote the famous book, The Feminine Mystique. She wrote directly to the White Housewives. That was her primary audience. I'm going to read you a quote that kind of embodies the book that you guys have read. I'm just reminding you about, all right? Each suburban wife struggles with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slip cover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured, Club Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even herself the silent question, is this all? This exploded in the world. Women everywhere were astonished with what this book had to say about their roles in their lives. Bell Hooks, Friedan, published in 1963. Bell Hooks, my girl over here, 1981, a couple decades later. She is all about black women and feminism. Notice the and, feminism. That's what we're reading out of today. And this is her quote. All too often in our society, it is assumed that no one can know all there is to know about black people by merely hearing the life story and opinions of one black person. Two different contrasted opinions, two different audiences, two different books written in two different decades. Both icons of second wave and third wave feminism and women's history in total. All right, here we begin at our documents. And our first document that you read today, it came from this lovely book, The American Women's Movement, 1945 to 2000. And it was actually written by the last name Sloan. This was document 26, which you guys all read before class. Thank you, thank you. All right, so we are going to read some quotes from this document. This is a primary source document written in 1974, so getting towards the end of second wave feminism, entering into the 1980s a little bit. And this document was titled Black Feminism, A New Mandate. I'm going to read. National Black Feminist Organization formed, believed that the civil rights movement did not pay enough attention to gender and sexism, and that the feminist movement did not pay enough attention to race and racism. While you guys are reading these quotes, be thinking, how did these two relationships of feminism and racism go together? What is the National Black Feminist Organization saying? Civil rights, messed up. Feminist organization, messed up. How can we work together? We felt that the duality of being black and female made us want to organize around those things that affect us the most. It is very important that we, as black women, set our own priorities. We lend support to feminist organizations and will work in coalitions that will affect 53% majority of the women in this country. They wanted to support feminist organizations and the black movement. In this mandate, we see not animosity towards one another. We see let's unite. Let's work together. Civil rights movement messed up a little bit, right? And now here we are at the feminist movement, kind of messing up too. We're not noticing race and racism. And that's kind of what Sloan is saying in this new mandate in 1974. How do we work together? Let's enter into another document from the same textbook. This is document 30, anonymous writer, 1977. 3 years later, what do we have here? A black feminist statement. We see black feminism as the logical political movement to combat the manifold and simultaneous oppressions that all colored women face. Very direct, her audience is to colored women. Black women's extremely negative opinions of the American political system, a system of white man rule, has always determined their membership into oppressed racial and sexist classes. Two oppressed racial and sexist classes, calling out two structures, racist and sexist, that colored women face every day. One issue that is of major concern to us and that we have to publicly address is racism, ding, 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 in the white women's movement. We are made constantly aware of how little effort white women have made to combat their own racism. We will continue to speak and demand accountability on this issue. This mandate is different, correct? We're not working together. We will demand that you are going to be accountable for the ways that you have not helped out your black women and black sisters and black daughters. That the white women are racist. That's what they are saying in this mandate 3 years later. Let's compare that to an Asian American woman and feminism mandate. We have here, written by Yamada, document 30 in the same book you guys have thoroughly enjoyed this semester. This one's a little bit different, talking about Oriental women. Or women organizations tell us that they would like to have us join them or ask our input. Every time I read or speak to a group of people about the condition of my life as an Asian American woman, as if I had never spoken, as if I was speaking to a group of people who had never known an Asian Pacific woman who was other than the passive, sweet stereotype of an Oriental woman. We are looking at a different ethnicity. We are looking at how they are perceived in feminist organizations. This is what I really want you guys to catch, this last line right here. Remembering the blatant acts of select racism in the past 3 decades in our country, our white sisters should be able to see how tenuous our position in this country is. What Yamada is calling out right now is that it is tenuous, is that it is dangerous for an Asian American Pacific woman to be a feminist in this country because of her skin tone, because of her ethnicity. White women are leading the feminist organization, and yes, there's barriers. There's sexist structures ahead of them that they have charged through. Add on race, add on being an Asian Pacific woman. In 1979, hitting the cusp of the third wave feminism, you are hitting more than sexism. It is dangerous for you to stand up as a sweet, passive, stereotypical Oriental woman and scream your rights, and say your rights, and say that you want change. And that's what white women have it focused on in this document, and that's what she's calling out, that she wants them to notice what is going on. Same with the last document, accountability. First document, that was a little bit more unified, and here we hit it home. Bell hooks hits it home. Ain't I woman, black women, and feminism. Chapter 4 is all about racism and feminism. The issue of accountability. We've seen that word twice now. The issue of accountability. Read with me. No history books informed us about racial imperialism. They talk about the American dream and how the U.S. was a big melting pot. For how does one overthrow, change, or even challenge a system that you've been taught to believe in, to admire, to love? The form of women's studies programs, which is what I'm in on this campus, as a teacher, is being established from white faculty literature, talking about all white women, written exclusively about all white people, and frequently have racist perspectives. This is the energy of the women's movement in America. You're a women's studies major, what are you reading? What are you looking at? What's your perspectives at? Where's your angles? We talked about that in this class. What are you teaching? What are your angles? What are your perspectives? History is broad, people. History is big. You got so many multi-layered, complex layers in there. So what are you reading? White women's studies programs, literature from white authors. White racial imperialism granted all white women the right to assume the role of the oppressor in relationship to black men and women. She's kind of extreme. And then Sojourner Truth stood up before the Second Annual Women's Convention. This was back in 1929. A white woman deemed her unfit to speak on a public platform screamed, "Don't let her speak, don't let her speak," at a national women's convention. So that is bell Hook's opinion. That is bell Hook's evidence. And wow, that's a lot to unpack. It's a lot to unpack about the relationship between ideology of racism and the relationship between the ideology of feminism, and how we see 4 different documents here, 4 different sources telling 4 different stories, but kind of synthesized in one theme. I like how she says we were taught to love America, and as historians we know this, but are the students who we're going to teach one day, are they going to know this? What perspective are they coming from? But we were taught to love America, we were taught about the big melting pot. I remember the day that I learned that, and yet we don't speak about how we become to be a big melting pot. Even she's calling out white women as being oppressors, being racist, not noticing what they are doing to their other sisters. Now I want you to know that this was back in 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We're living in the 21st century, and 4th wave feminism is a whole different context filled with inclusivity, and us looking around, and as Christians, us looking around and picking up the widows and the orphans, right? The black women. They've been lowest on the pedestal since they stepped in this country as slaves. And that's what bell Hooks is talking about. She speaks about devalued black women's bodies, talking about rape, seen as sex objects, seen as Sojourner Truth being an educated woman eventually, and has a lot to say about the women's movement, yelled off the stage because of her skin color. Now, feminist organizations were built off of racism. We looked at skin color, and yet we ignored those around us. So to go back into the picture of these first slides, we see that these women I chose, again, I chose them. So there were other pictures, I chose them. These are white women on the internet. I type in 1960s women and white women show up. I type in 1990s and this still shows up. So these are the women I'm talking about. These are the women who formed coalitions. These are the women who fought for our vote and who were extremely racist back in the 1920s, 1930s. And so we still are constantly living in that bubble, and I encourage us as future historians to get out, to see perspectives, to see angles, to understand empathy, to understand the layers, to understand our students, to understand the different angles that history has come from, to know that this is just Dr. Johnson's opinion and perspective. It's a lot of other ones, and you might disagree, and that's the beauty of it. Hoorah! Anyway, sorry, synthesizing themes. What does this all mean? White women created the feminist movements in the 2nd and 3rd waves. We created them, we embodied them, we wrote them down, we fought for them. Therefore, racism was rampant in the feminist movement between any minorities of color. I'm not talking about black and white. You saw the Asian American document. Is this a pattern of history? And that's what I want you guys to think, that will continue itself. How will we, as modern historians sitting in 2021, choose to acknowledge the complexity of women's history and view the specific past from all angles, all perspectives, and all ethnicities? All right, and these are some sources I used. Again, you have been reading these books as you will continue to read them throughout the semester. But just acknowledging this. Racism and sexism, or racism and feminism. What did women have to go to who are white? Sexism. What did women of color have to go through? Sexism. Oh, and top on that, racism. And that's the main point of this, is the relationship, the correlation, how they moved, how it breathed, how it was organized, how it settled now into our communities as we're living in 21st century, is look back at the past and see what was there. Remember in U.S. history, we learned that the slave owners' wives were the most horrible, right? Their husbands were sleeping with the slaves, but they were the most cruel. And that pattern was way back in U.S. history. But I dare say there's lingering evidence of that throughout the 20th century that we still have to explore. And even the 21st century, let's convey this with truth and honesty and complexity and questions that it deserves to be conveyed with. So thank you for being here in class today. Thank you for interestingly diving into this topic with me. It's not always a fun one. Sometimes it's extreme. Sometimes it's ideologies, isms. They're crazy, and this is why Dr. Kennedy hates them. But Dr. Johnson loves to talk about this stuff. If you want to come to office hours, you can, Mondays at 2 to 4. Madison Hall, because this is, you guys actually didn't know, but you're at George Washington University right now. So come on by and we can talk more about this. Again, do your reading, do your reflection papers. Thank you so much.